All right, hello everybody. Just waiting a minute for the waiting room to empty. I've also disabled the waiting room, so that shouldn't be an issue for the rest of the event. But welcome, good evening, good morning, or for some, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for a special joint seminar, virtual seminar, on the new Takaichi administration's implications for Japanese politics and foreign policy. My name is Adam Liff, and I'm co-hosting this event in my capacity as director of the 21st Century Japan Politics and Society Initiative here at Indiana University. Now, tonight's event marks 21 JPSI's second collaboration with my co-host, Philip Lipsey, director of the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the University of Toronto. We are extremely pleased to also welcome as co-sponsors Toronto's Asian Institute, Harvard University's Program on U.S.-Japan Relations, and the Japanese Politics Online Seminar Series. So given the extraordinary number of people from around the world who signed up for tonight's event, well over 300 the last time I checked this afternoon, I think it's no exaggeration to say that there's a tremendous amount of interest in what last month's historic election of Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi means not only for Japan, but also for the US, Canada, and really for the entire world. Though she only took office 2 weeks ago, Prime Minister Takaichi has already left quite a mark on Japanese politics and foreign relations, even before officially taking up her post as Prime Minister. The first half of October witnessed the historic collapse of the 26-year-old Liberal Democratic Party Komeito partnership and the LDP's formation of a new minority coalition with the Japan Innovation Party, or Ishin. This pair of developments seems all but certain to have significant implications, not only for our administration's approach to governance and policy, but also for the LDP's prospects in the next election. After moving into Kante on October 21st, she hit the ground running, quickly forming a cabinet featuring names both very familiar and somewhat less familiar to longtime watchers of Japanese politics. And in just the past week, she has not only hosted Donald Trump for a successful state visit, she also traveled to Malaysia and South Korea for various other international gatherings, including additional bilateral summit meetings with Mark Carney of Canada, Lee Jae-myung of South Korea, and Xi Jinping. Although it's still early days and much remains uncertain about what the future holds, to help us understand what we can expect from the new Prime Minister and her cabinet, I'm thrilled to be able to welcome really an all-star academic panel from across North America. After each speaker offers prepared remarks of 4 to 5 minutes each, my co-host will moderate a discussion and audience Q&A while I manage the technical side of the event from behind the scenes. So please submit your question at any time using the Q&A button you can find at the bottom of your screen. You may need to click on More in order to see that option. And if possible, when submitting your question, please identify both yourself, if you're comfortable, and to which of our panelists you are directing your questions. So before I turn things over to our first speaker, I just want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. And without further ado, let's dive in. I'd like to now invite our first speaker, Daniel Smith from the University of Pennsylvania, to share his thoughts on the significance of Takaichi's election as Japan's first female prime minister. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to join this roundtable tonight. And as a sort of bonus, I'd like to plug a book that's coming out next month, Japan Decides 2024, Japanese general election, which covers the most recent lower house election. It's coming out from Palgrave Macmillan next month. It's edited by myself, along with Kenneth McElwain from the University of Tokyo, and Robert Pekkanen from the University of Washington, and features 20 chapters from many fantastic contributors. So have a look out for that next month. So as Adam mentioned, Takaichi Sanae's election as prime minister is a historic event for Japan, but also in the global context of women's leadership, it's an important development, and beats the United States in terms of having a female at the top position of leadership a woman at the top position of leadership in the country. And so I wanted to just say a couple things to put that into context and think about how that might be framed depending on how her tenure in office goes. So as many of you probably know, Japan's record for gender representation in politics is fairly poor. In the previous lower house election in 2021, only 45 women were elected. That's 10% of the chamber. And representation of women had been about 10% for several years, somewhat stagnant. In the 2024 election, 73 women were elected, which brought women's representation in that chamber up to 16%. And that included 32 newcomers, women who had never been elected previously or were not incumbents. So Japan is improving in terms of gender representation, and of course, the biggest prize of prime minister has now been achieved. The glass ceiling has been broken in the cabinet for the prime minister through Takaichi Sanae. But Japan's gender representation is still low in comparison to other countries, in particular other advanced industrialized democracies. So it's 16% now in the lower house, but the global average is 27%. And moreover, in last year's World Economic Forum Gender Gap Index, Japan placed 118th out of 146 countries. So there's still more work to go. But I wanted to say a little bit about what Takaichi's path to power means in the comparative context. So in some ways, Takaichi's selection as prime minister is similar to the emergence of women prime ministers elsewhere. And in some ways, it's different. She's a conservative from the Liberal Democratic Party. That's not all that uncommon. In many countries, the first woman to become prime minister or president will tend to come from a conservative party, which may be surprising given that parties of the left tend to nominate more women on average. So you might think of Margaret Thatcher or Theresa May later in the UK, along with Liz Truss, or in Germany, Angela Merkel, or more recently in Italy, Giorgia Meloni. And in this way, Takaichi Sanae kind of follows a well-trodden path to power that goes through conservative parties for women, somewhat paradoxically or unexpectedly. She's different from other women leaders in that she does not come from a political dynasty. This also makes her different from many of the women in the LDP who do tend to come from political dynasties. About 25% of members of the Japanese Diet come from political dynasties, and the rate is higher for women in politics. This is partly because women face barriers to entry in male-dominated political spheres, and political dynasties are one channel through which women can overcome those barriers. Takaichi didn't have to come through a political dynasty to achieve power. She did have powerful male mentors like Abe Shinzo, who kind of cultivated her political rise over time. So that's two things I want to say about her pathway into politics and how it's similar and different from other female prime ministers. The second thing that people might be wondering about is whether Takaichi comes to power in a sort of glass cliff scenario. So in the literature on gender representation, there's one idea of the glass ceiling that women aren't able to rise above a certain position. Another idea is that when they do, it's when the circumstances are at their worst. So women are sort of set up to fail by coming into the office when the country or the party is at a particular weak point. And in some ways, this is true, that the LDP has turned to Takaichi at their weakest point in recent memory, certainly since they were out of power in 2009 to 2012. And it's the second consecutive election with the House of Councilors election in July and the 2024 election last October, in which the LDP has lost its majority in the chamber. So as Adam mentioned, the LDP is currently governing in a minority coalition with sort of outside support from Ishin, and it has lost its support of its long-term coalition partner, Komeito. But I wanted to sort of caution against putting too much stock in the glass cliff scenario. Takaichi will have a hard time navigating this current political moment. But if she ends up staying in office for more than a year, she'll be doing better than most LDP prime ministers in recent memory, all of whom have been men. So since the period of Abe Shinzo's long period as prime minister, each prime minister who has come after him, Suga Yoshihide, Kishida Fumio, and Ishiba Shigeru, have served relatively short terms in office. So surviving longer than a year would be a great feat. And if she ends up resigning within that time frame, I don't think we should consider it to have been a gendered dynamic so much as a systemic problem of LDP leadership in Japan. So that's where I'll end my remarks today, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panelists.
All right, thank you, Dan. Continuing with the focus on domestic politics, our next speaker will be Amy Katalinak from New York University, who will discuss the implications of the LDP's historic decision last month to change its coalition partner from Komeito to the Japan Restoration Party, also known as Ishin. Amy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much to Adam and also to Philip for inviting me to be here this evening. I'm looking forward to what all of my fellow panelists have to say and also to your questions this evening. So I would like to talk a little bit about what the breakup of the coalition means, what may have caused the rupture in relationship between the LDP and the Komeito, and then finally what we should expect in the coming months. So as I'm sure many of us tonight are aware, on October 10, a mere 6 days after Ms. Takaichi became LDP president, the Komeito announced that the coalition was being dissolved. They were drawing a line under all of the coordination that had happened before. So this has two implications. First, and most immediately, it meant that the LDP lost the support of the Komeito in both houses of the Diet. This makes it more difficult to pass legislation. Second, it means that many LDP lower house incumbents are now much more vulnerable than they were before. Why? The Komeito was giving them the votes that they needed to get over the finish line in their electoral district races. So the reality today is that there are many LDP politicians, primarily from urban districts, who would not be in the Diet today were it not be for the Komeito. And I just want to give a shout out to research done by Adam Liff and Komeito on this topic, and also Kuniaki Nemoto, and also myself and my co-author, Lucia Motolinia. So this has been written about extensively. It's been confirmed to me in elections, in interviews many times. So this is a far bigger implication of the rupture of the coalition. Now, there are also LDP politicians who are independently strong, who don't need the Komeito, and who have been decidedly less happy with the LDP's partnership with it. After all, the Komeito is a pacifist party. Traditionally, it's humanitarian socialism, and many of those LDP politicians felt that it restrained the LDP's freedom of movement in the policy space. So it follows that after the rupture of the coalition, the LDP politicians who are unhappy with the coalition are going to be happier now without the coalition. But they're not going to be happier if 50 of their peers lose their seats in the next election and the LDP is deprived of a majority. What possibly could have caused this rupture? So let me start by saying that people, both scholars who've worked on this and people inside both parties, didn't really see this breakup coming. So the two parties have weathered a lot. Establishing the coordination in the early 2000s was very difficult. I've done extensive research on this. Losing the election in 2009 was also very difficult. And then the LDP pushing ahead with the security legislation in the mid-2010s was also very difficult. So at these three times, both parties had leaders who were committed to the coalition. And this was costly for the Komeito. This meant, in 2015, they had to explain to the party's pacifist supporters why the reinterpretation of the ban on collective self-defense was necessary. In 2009, it meant convincing supporters not to desert the LDP in favor of the DPJ, with whom, there could have been greater policy alignment. And in the early 2000s, it meant putting up with LDP candidates who were ignoring their leaders' requests not to run in certain districts. And then they ran anyway, which led to lower than expected vote tallies for Komeito candidates. So the two parties have weathered a lot. For the past 2 years, the Komeito have also been weathering something new. It's not new for the LDP, but it's new for the coalition, a money politics scandal in the LDP. So I'm sure many of us here tonight are familiar with this, but essentially media investigations revealed that several LDP factions and LDP individuals had not been following the law when it came to disclosing income and expenditure gleaned mostly from fundraising parties. So there was anger over the scandal, and then there was the inability of LDP leaders, Kishida and also Ishiba, to also do much about it, and that caused the LDP's support rate to drop. So this has had dire consequences for the Komeito's ability to mobilize votes. And remember that it mobilizes votes both for itself and also for the LDP. So in last year's election, the party did really badly. I would say it suffered greater losses than the LDP. It fielded candidates in 11 different districts. LDP candidates were not in those districts, and it only won 4 of them. And the people who lost were all, not all, but mostly experienced Komeito politicians with 4 terms, 5 terms, even 10 terms under their belts. Since then, we also had another election which the Komeito didn't do well, the upper house election this year. After that, the Komeito decided to elect a new leader, Mr. Tetsuo Saito. So we're never going to be able to know why Mr. Saito and his team made this decision, but I would speculate that the party is in a tough spot electorally, and it wanted the LDP to take certain actions to get it out of that tough spot. So for a while, the Komeito's strategy was to communicate what it wanted and wait for that to be realized. But I think that the election of Ms. Takaichi as leader and her policy positions on several issues made them think that waiting and seeing was not getting them anywhere and they were better off leaving. So they may have left forever, or this may be a strategy to try and get the LDP to do more of what they want. So moving now to the question, what should we expect in the coming months? So to think about this, I sat down and I thought about, what does the LDP need to do right now? It needs to do 2 things. 1, it needs to govern. And 2, it needs to carve out a strategy for winning the next election. So for the past few elections, its strategy has been to have a combination of relatively strong candidates who don't need any extra help. And if you would like to know why they don't need any extra help, can I just do a little plug for my book? Dominance Through Division, Group-Based Clientelism in Japan. It will explain why there are some candidates in the LDP who are very strong, who don't need any extra help, but they have those candidates, and they also have these weaker candidates who do need help and who get that help from the Komeito. But the second element of the party's electoral strategy has now evaporated. So all those LDP candidates who were weaker before are now much weaker. So what we're observing right now, I think, is that Ms. Takaichi is trying to create a situation where she, as the party leader, can give that edge to those LDP candidates. She can be so popular that she can make up for the loss of support from the Komeito. The problem is that edge that she's trying to give them, her popularity, may evaporate. And if it does, I think there's a good chance that those weaker LDP members will desert her in favor of trying to resurrect the relationship with the Komeito. So you might think, where is the LDP's new coalition partner in all of this? Can Nippon Ishin no Kai replace Komeito? And the answer to this is not easily. So being closer ideologically might smooth the passage of legislation, but it doesn't help the parties establish electoral coordination. Electoral coordination is more important in Japan than in other countries because of the single seat district tier. So the entire country of Japan is divided into 289 districts, and there's only one winner in each of those districts. So any 2 parties that want to coordinate have to work out who's going to run in each district and who's going to stand down. So this was very difficult to establish with the Komeito, and it took several elections. So Ishin is a regional party. It captured, so just to give you a sense of how dominant it is, it captured every single seat, 19 seats in Osaka Prefecture in the last lower house election. So if the 2 parties decide to coordinate, Ishin probably will make the case that it deserves to have all those districts in Osaka. Whether the LDP candidates in those districts would cooperate is an open question. It's also not clear what Ishin can provide the LDP in return for those seats. It doesn't have pockets of support all over the country like the Komeito did. So to return to those weaker LDP candidates, Ishin doesn't have much to provide them. So against this background, how can we understand the promise to reduce the number of diet seats? Fine, this fits with the Ishin's overall interest in increasing government efficiency, small government, deregulation. But because the LDP and Ishin have lots of incumbent members who are in districts, the cuts are going to come from the PR tier. So what PR seats do is they provide a voice for small parties. They reduce the disproportionality in the conversion of votes to seats. So it's highly unusual for a small party to advocate cutting the number of PR seats. But Ishin is unlike other small parties in Japan in that it's very heavily regionally focused, so it does do better in the district tier than in the PR tier. However, A small party that does do better in the PR tier and will suffer if seats in that tier are cut is Komeito. So when thinking about why this issue and why now, I'm going to leave you with that thought. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amy. Our next speaker will be Christina Davis from Harvard, who will share her thoughts on the significance of last week's Trump Takaichi summit and the U.S.-Japan trade deal. Christina, over to you.
Thanks so much for hosting this. It's great to join everyone. Well, not many world leaders look forward to a summit with President Donald Trump. He has infamously humiliated leaders, and so it is quite a challenge as a newly elected prime minister for Takaichi to meet with Trump, and she pulled it off pretty well. It's also true that when we think of LDP politics, helping to manage the US-Japan relationship is considered a very important task of the prime minister. And so for her to get off to a strong start in a tough summit and having it go well is really a big success. Now, part of it is personal politics, that she was able to portray herself as the protege of former Prime Minister Abe, who was one of the closest leaders with Donald Trump, and that helped for the personal dynamics. Part of it is ideology. Prime Minister Takaichi is an ultra-conservative and lines up very well with the conservative preferences of Donald Trump, who is shown with his favoritism to Javier Milei in Argentina and other leaders, that as long as you have right-wing politics, he's got your back. So I do think that personal politics and ideological affinity helped the summit. But still, it could be tough. And here we can think about where Takaichi's interest is a hawk are to increase defense spending. And that is exactly what the United States has been demanding across administrations. But certainly Donald Trump put on the accelerator of the demands for defense spending from Japan. And so her willingness, she's long been at the forefront of the LDP call to increase defense spending to 2%. And she said she would do it quicker than had been the plan. So they're pulling that forward by a year or two. And she's happily talking about revisiting export of defense systems, purchasing more US defense systems, and quite a few areas of defense cooperation. But the other side is, of course, trade. And this is where it's quite interesting. If you focus on, Trump as a tariff man that has long had Japan alongside China as part of the problem since his early days in the 80s of bashing Japan, it's really a difficult task to maintain a stable US-Japan trade relationship. And yet it appears that Takaichi's been able to uphold the September US-Japan bilateral trade agreement. Is that a good agreement? It depends what your starting point is. If it's that they've done better than the 40% tariffs or 50% that are getting thrown on India or Brazil, yes, a 15% tariff is better, of course, compared to what had been an average of 2.5% US tariff. It's obviously an increase. But Japan is still an export-dependent state. Over 20% of GDP is from exports, and it was really quite devastating when the US had raised tariffs. And so the last report, the July-September quarter, shows Japan's GDP shrank 2.4%, largely because of a large decline in exports shaped by the tariffs that the US is imposing. So holding this negotiated agreement with the US is important. What's that agreement got in it? I mean, we were all interested. Japan putting forward this $550 billion investment commitment. And with the Trump administration, actually calling it like a signing bonus that a baseball player makes, that he gets to allocate where those funds go. But it's not quite like that. The day after the agreement, they were disagreeing on how it would be interpreted. But I think where they actually have an overlapping interest set is they share a view about investment in critical industries. And Japan is already the source of $800 billion of investment in the United States. So the timeline to expand to 550 billion, depending on how you count what is the investment and when it happens, is not as novel a change. There certainly was no meeting of the Diet to pass an emergency budget for writing a check to the Trump administration. It's going to be administered by a new part of JBIC, largely as loans for investment projects. They've already pulled up a list at the summit, including a lot of energy investments, the natural gas development in Alaska. We can imagine other areas where Japan may have mutual interest with the United States. So I think for Takaichi, upholding that trade agreement is the best she could get, and appointing Akazawa as the METI minister, who has built ties with the United States, reassures the United States they're going to uphold the commitment. At the same time, he's a tough negotiator, and they're not writing a check to the United States. They are playing banker for investment projects based on mutual interests to share critical supply chains and profitable investment deals. I think I've probably used my minutes, but I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Christina. So for our next speaker, we'll be leaving the Northeast Corridor for Southern California, from where Saori Katada from USC will share her perspective on the Takaichi administration's likely approach to economic security. Saori, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I thank Adam and Philip for organizing this very exciting panel. I just came back from Japan actually today in the middle of the day. I was there for a week, and the kind of excitement about the new and female prime minister is pretty strongly felt there. She is the one who wants to put Japan back on the map. There's someone who is talking about Japan is back, it's back. It's the kind of Laurie Institute's kind of report on it. She wants to have strong and prosperous Japan. So what I would like to talk about is emphasizing on the economic security, which is basically the securitization of economic issues, or maybe the fusion of economics and national security. Takaichi is very kind of well-known figure in this area. She was, I guess, before being a prime minister, was the Minister of State for Economic Security for 2 years. She's the second one after, Kobayashi was the first round. And then before that, she was also well-versed in intelligence and communication, having worked as the Minister of Internal Affairs and Communication. So all in all, for 4 years actually under Prime Minister Abe. So all in all, she's very well versed in these issue areas. And by the way, since I was there, I bought, this is not my advertisement, it's hers. This is a book that Takaichi wrote on Japan's Keizai Anzen Hoshou, the economic security issues. So this she wrote it, she published it about a year or so ago, July of 2024. So she is a well-known figure in this economic security issues. And I would like to emphasize 3 kind of particular issues that she's actively engaged in. So first of all, as all of you probably have heard of, LDP has been putting forward this economic security in the sense of strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability. And to me, Takaichi's strategy is putting strategic indispensability pretty upfront. So it's much more proactive, kind of offensive, I would say, economic security rather than the defensive one. This is to strategize to gain technological leadership and edge for Japan. And this is for competitiveness and leverage sake. So not only, Economic Security Act has been put in place in various pillars in May of 2022, but the emphasis here is to strengthen Japan's technological capability in semiconductors. Many of other kind of critical technologies. Now, I think the people talk a lot about this perovskite, batteries, which I don't know what it is, but scientists can tell us what that is, kind of a cutting edge, digital technology, quantum science, nuclear fusion, etc., etc. So in some ways, this is a way to get the strong basis of the government targeting these industries. In some ways, the kind of the new industrial policy going on. The second, obviously, is more of this economic strategic autonomy side, where that emphasizes the risk management. So Kiki Kanri Toshi, the risk managing investment, is her strong thing, where the government will invest in areas such as economic security, food security, energy security, various other things, not including national resilience, and health security. It's another one. Anyway, so this is both ways, both the indispensability and autonomy. There is a very strong smell of this new industrial policy going on, and with her active fiscal policy, she is going to spend quite a significant amount, or committed to spend a significant amount of government resources in these areas as the center of Japan's growth strategy. And finally, the third pillar for her is to build institutions related to economic security. So she has already kind of started to plan on establishing Committee on Foreign Investment. So this is the kind of Japanese version of the CFIUS you probably heard of. This is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US. So this is a kind of investment screening institution that she's going to establish. She was going to beef up the intelligence capacity, maybe kind of thinking about the bureaus or some kind of institution related to that. In order to enhance the security of various critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. And finally, she will be looking at foreign labor management issues, even though one thing I would say is that she hasn't talked about limiting kind of technical people who are coming into Japan, because I think that's a really important item for Japan to maintain. Anyway, this is going to be a very active agenda for her, and we will see a lot of things coming out of Japan. So keep tuned. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Saudi. Next, I'd like to invite Philip from the University of Toronto to discuss his expectations for the government's approach to energy security and the environment.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And I would like to remind the audience that we will have a Q&A after we're all done. Currently, we just have a set of comedic questions from Dave Laney, including whether Koizumi Shinjiro is going to rename the Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of War to match the sexiness of Pete Hegseth. So if you prefer to ask more substantive questions, we're welcoming those at any time. Of course, we'd love to answer Dave's great questions as well. In any case, so the broader context of Japanese environmental policy, really is that, Japan used to be at the cutting edge in many ways in the 1990s in terms of energy efficiency and so forth, but it became a bit of a laggard. It was one of the relative underperformers under the Kyoto Protocol, and eventually withdrew from the second commitment round. Energy prices and taxes in Japan have been falling during an era when many countries have been raising those levies to try to disincentivize the use of fossil fuels. And there's been a loss of industrial leadership in areas like solar panels to China, which is causing some significant problems today for Japanese industry. The Abe government, Trevor and Serdi and I have described the Abe energy policy as Abenomics, which is basically, using energy and climate policy to promote the macroeconomic goals of Abenomics. So, it was kind of promoted in terms of green language, join Japan to save the planet type of PR materials, but ultimately it focused on trying to get the Japanese economy moving. So it involved low energy prices, stable energy supply, promoting environmental technology selectively in a way that benefits Japanese firms rather than foreign firms. The Suga government significantly represented a bit of a transition point in 2020 with the announcement of a net zero target. And I think in various ways, Kishida and Ishiba continued that trend, which, to some extent reestablished Japan as a country that is seriously committed to dealing with global climate change goals. And although, it's still in early days of the Takaichi government, I think it's fair to say that what we've seen so far looks like something more like the Abe approach rather than what we saw after Suga. So Takaichi herself has expressed very deep skepticism towards solar power very recently in the LDP presidency race, among other fora. And this stems really from the domination of the production of solar panels by China, which at this point has become a bit of a economic security risk for Japan, as Saudi was mentioning. And so, it might be nice to promote renewables, but do we want to be completely dependent on China has become the tone of discussion in Japan. So Takaichi has leaned towards an emphasis on nuclear. She has refused a request by the US administration to reduce LNG imports from Russia, which is quite notable in an otherwise relatively kind of celebratory bilateral meeting. And so, in terms of moving forward, it seems like the probable policies here are going to be relatively pro-fossil fuel, cooperation with the US, Canada, and other countries on LNG. We're going to see a reduction in gasoline taxes. This is not really about Takaichi, but something that the opposition parties were pushing because they thought that might be a vote winner. Likely reduction in government support for renewable energy, and a promotion of industry and technology that gives Japan an advantage, right? So this includes the solar cells that Saudi was mentioning that you can basically bend and place on different surfaces where Japanese firms have an advantage, geothermal, hydrogen fuel cells, energy efficiency technology, among other things. So I would consider environment climate change to be an area, unlike some others potentially, where Japan could potentially step in and support the liberal international order, even as the U.S. might be withdrawing. I don't think energy and climate change is likely to be that type of issue area. In many ways, Japan will likely continue to be a laggard, although it is an important source of crucial technologies that have some promise for dealing with some of the major environmental issues that the world is facing. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back to Adam. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Philip. Well, I now have the task of presenting sixth of six speakers and trying to say something new, and I know everyone is eager to get to the discussion, so I'll try to keep this short and focus narrowly on the topic of defense policy, but at a general level. So I think big picture, I expect the Takaichi government to continue, but also try to further accelerate the basic reform trajectory that she has inherited from successive LDP-led governments going back at least to 2013, and which arguably even traces some of its roots back to the DPJ period or earlier. Now, behind that defense reform trajectory has been a broad consensus among political elites in Japan on three things. And this consensus is largely superpartisan, not universal, but not limited to any one party. First, that Japan's security environment is getting much worse. Second, that bolstering deterrence is critically important to prevent what government officials typically refer to as unilateral changes to the status quo by force, be it in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, across the Taiwan Strait, or much further afield. And third, that the best way to strengthen deterrence is the three-track approach articulated in both Japan's 2013 and 2022 national security strategies. That is, bolstering Japan's own defense capabilities, strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance, and deepening Japan's security partnerships with other U.S. treaty allies and partners like Australia, Canada, Korea, and the Philippines. Now, what we have already seen from Takaichi over the last few days, and Christina touched on this already, I expect this to continue, and that's an effort to accelerate that reform trajectory. Rather than a fundamental disjuncture effort to take Japan down a radical new path, to accelerate the current reform trajectory. And I know that nuance may not make for a sexy media headline, but it's likely to be the reality, as it has been, frankly, to varying degrees for the past half dozen prime ministers. I don't have time to get into the specifics of what might be in store. I just got back from Tokyo myself last week and had some very interesting conversations. But I think the most conspicuous evidence of efforts to accelerate has been two concrete pledges that Takaichi has already made. First, that Japan would meet the 2% of GDP target for defense-related spending by the end of this year, and that's 2 years ahead of schedule. And second, that her government now plans to revise by the end of next fiscal year all 3 of Japan's major national security documents that were revised only 3 years ago, technically less than 3 years ago. And this is also ahead of schedule. But I want to emphasize that there's been significant chatter in Tokyo about at least the latter since long before Takaichi was elected prime minister. So I think it's important in the months and years ahead, as long as she's prime minister, to avoid overly personalizing these decisions. That's something that we saw happen, in my view at least, far too often during the nearly 8 years that Abe Shinzo was prime minister the second time, from 2012 to 2020. Now, it's still early days, and I definitely have far more questions than answers about what comes next. But since time is limited, I'll end by raising one of the biggest question marks in my mind. And this touches on something that Amy was focused on. It has to do with domestic politics. I'm particularly eager to see what the combination of the LDP's loss of its majority in the lower house last year on the one hand, and its selection of a new coalition partner this year mean for the pace, scale, and content of what the new government can achieve in the defense space. For instance, how significantly will the 2026 national security documents differ from the ones announced just 3 years ago? Will some proposals that have abruptly entered mainstream defense policy in debates in recent weeks, including those put forward by Ishin, such as nuclear-powered submarines, referred to euphemistically in the official documents, will those be worked in? Something like that would be a very big deal. And in this regard, what is of particular interest to me relates to the collapse of the LDP Komeito coalition and the LDP's invitation to that fellow conservative party to join a new one. As Amy already kindly pointed out, in an article Komeito and I published a few years ago, we sought to demonstrate how unique features of the now defunct LDP Komeito partnership not only allowed Komeito and its pacifistic support base to play a role as a brake, a so-called hadome, in LDP security ambitions, they were also the open secret behind a significant chunk of the LDP's electoral success for the reasons Amy already mentioned. Now, on the one hand, this suggests that if the LDP's previous coalition partner acted as a brake on its defense policy reform ambitions, then its new coalition partner may function as more of an accelerant. Indeed, reading Ishin's 21st Century National Defense Concept paper just a week ago and last month's coalition agreement make clear that they have a lot of common ground on defense policy with the LDP. But on the other hand, I think there are open questions about how they will cooperate with other parties. They are a minority coalition after all, and perhaps more importantly, how durable this new coalition will be. The LDP-Komeito partnership lasted for over a quarter century, and the LDP single-party majority persisted for most of the post-2012 period, in large part due to the party's close cooperation in national elections, which effectively evolved into something that Ko and I referred to as a kind of codependence. The LDP and Ishin seem very unlikely to have that. I'd also note that Ishin has conspicuously refused a cabinet post, and you've seen key party leaders in recent weeks suggest they need to be ready to leave the coalition at any moment. We also have no clear idea whether or how they might hurt rather than help each other in the next national election. Now, that all said, it seems likely that changing coalition partners will be more of an enabler than a constraint on the Takaichi government's ambitious defense reform agenda, at least as long as the LDP-Ishin partnership persists and until the next lower house election. So in closing, I think it's going to be very important going forward not to fall victim to the common tendency to overlook the complex interplay between Japanese domestic politics and defense policy. In the real world, what Japan ultimately chooses to do in this space is every bit as important as what its leaders choose not to do. So I'll certainly be watching this space closely in the months and years to come. Now with that, I'll end and pass the co-hosting baton to Philip to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.